Curt Smith, welcome back to the baseball bookshelf.
Ron, great to be here. Great to be with you.
This is long overdue. Your book, The Presidents and the Pastime, came out a couple of years ago,
Right.
and I've been meaning to have you on, but time and other obligations get in the way. Congratulations on another excellent book,
Well, thank you.
entertaining, informative, and fun.
Well, I tried to have fun. It certainly beats the alternative. But beginning this book, the only question was not why I would write it. I mean, you're talking about two topics, two of the very few topics I allegedly know anything about, baseball and politics. But why it took me so long, because these are two subjects that I've been fascinated by ever since I was 6, 7 years old, growing up in upstate New York, and would run downstairs to get the morning newspaper, 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, and I would turn to what? I would turn to baseball, and I would turn to politics. So I do think that that men, much more than women, tend to retain lifelong the things that mesmerize them when they're young, and certainly that was true of me. And so finally, I got around to writing this book about the umbilical cord between baseball and the presidency. And I was delighted to find, and this is true of any writer, that no one had ever done this before. So it took me several years to write. The writing was not necessarily fun, although there were many humorous moments, some inadvertent by the presidents and some intentional. But the end product is one that I was very pleased with, and it sold well. It was critiqued well, which again beats the alternative. And these are two institutions. I mean, they've been with us, the presidency, obviously since the very birth of the republic, and the baseball, which in our mind's eye seems to be almost as old, but certainly goes back at least to the 18th century. And in fact, as I found, even during the awful winter at Valley Forge, when George Washington, who was not yet president, but rather a mere general, must have despaired daily, he found relief in throwing a spear which resembled a baseball back and forth with his aide-de-camp. And this is a derivative of the British game of rounders. And the mother country in this sense was played by the future father of our country. And this was really the first incident that I found that involved a future president of the United States. And since then, Ron, virtually every one of them has either liked baseball, in some cases loved baseball, or feigned an interest in baseball, because to do so would have been inviting the populace to boot them out of the office. And if there's one thing that people in the White House like, it's keeping their job.
Now, just to be fair to you, it's not like you've been lazing around. You've got more than a dozen other books out on in circulation, several of which are about baseball, others are about
Yes.
politics. So don't sell yourself short about having to take so long to do this. But I'm curious. You say some of this was not fun. What was not fun about it?
Well, the sheer drudgery, to some extent, of research, the editing. The editing is, Dorothy Parker, who was a member famously of the Algonquin Club and a wonderful writer in her own right, was once asked about writing. And she said, asked if writing was fun. She said, "No, writing is not fun. Having writ is fun. I enjoy having writ." And I think that she delineated perhaps better than anyone the difference between writing and having writ. Writing can be absolutely drudgery, hell on earth. You pick the metaphor, they fit. Because unlike, let's say, when you do a radio broadcast, in your case, not so much, but if you do a television broadcast, as I have, and for better or for worse, when you do it, it's done. That's not true with the book. Any writer, by and large, will verify that a writer is never satisfied with the 5th or 10th or 15th draft and he or she never wants to let it go.
Hmm.
Is always insistent and trying to get the editor or the publisher to bring it back. Let me have another draft, and never satisfied really with the end result. I have found that that's true of me, and as a result, it's always with you. When you're doing a book, you can be out, having a couple, as Harry Carey would say, and at a bar or a restaurant, and you'll be thinking, geez, that line that I had really didn't work. Maybe if I twist it around, it will work a bit better. So, or you're out for a walk, or you're at your job, your day job, and it'll come to you that I almost had this. Maybe if I tried something a bit different, it would be good, or good even better. And again, that's not true of many 9-to-5 jobs. Not to in any event denigrate them, because they do the real work that keeps the country going. I just write for a living, but as well as teach. But it's work. It's hard work. Richard Nixon, God bless him. He often said that he would never write a book. And then he wrote a book after he had been vice president and almost beaten John F. Kennedy in 1960. And the name of the book was Six Crises. And he called writing it his seventh crisis, because he found it hard work. The hardest work, in fact, that he said he ever gave his brain. And he said he vowed never to write another one. Well, he did. He wrote 10 more, and most of them were bestsellers. But to his deathbed, he always said that writing was the hardest work that he had ever had. And at least in my life, I have found that to be true as well. But the flip side is that books endure, for better or for worse. And when you go to someone's house, if they've got a library, to see your book there, or to see books by friends, or to see books that you particularly admire, is a very nice thing to have happen.
You mentioned Nixon, so we might as well start with him. Would you say, out of all the presidents that are profiled in your book, he was the biggest and most knowledgeable fan?
Yes, I would. Bob Costas and I were once talking, and I won't name drop past him, but he is extraordinarily knowledgeable and fascinating in fields that go beyond baseball. And he and I were talking years ago, and I'm a conservative, and he is a liberal, I think, as far as those labels apply. And both of us independently came to the same conclusion that Richard Nixon is the most fascinating public figure of our age. Keep in mind, we're both baby boomers. That might not apply to younger people today. But there's no question that Nixon was an encyclopedia of baseball. Not as a player, he was a lousy athlete, but he grew up in California following the then AA Los Angeles Angels. And when he went to Washington, he did so after having been a law student at Duke in North Carolina. And from Los Angeles to North Carolina, he detoured on his way there, his first year as a law student, to see a doubleheader at Griffith Stadium. And even in his old age, he could remember that DiMaggio had hit two run homers in a doubleheader at Griffith Stadium, that the Yankees had won a doubleheader, and that the day was July 4th, 1936. I went back, checked the baseball register, bingo, he batted 1,000. He was correct on all three. And this was when he was in his upper 70s. And he was such a baseball student of the game, in every sense of the term, that in 1965, in those wilderness years, as they called it, between having lost to Kennedy in 1960 and winning the presidency in 1969, that the Major League Baseball offered him, first of all, the players offered him what would have been the position of the first director of the Players Union. Nixon turned it down because, as he later said, he had other plans. So the other plans included winning the presidency. And then that same year of 65, the owners of Major League Baseball offered him the commissionership of baseball. This was after Ford Frick retiring, and they had not yet offered the job to the unknown soldier, William Eckert. And Nixon turned this down, sadly for baseball. He would have been a great commissioner in every sense of the term. But he gets to the presidency, and in 1969, the 100th anniversary of baseball, professional baseball, he holds this magnificent soiree at the White House to honor the big leagues. And Hank Aaron said that Nixon had the reception line, and he was introducing the players before the players could introduce themselves. And he knew so much about each player's career that the players were absolutely stunned. Hank Aaron was quoted that night as saying that Nixon knew more about the game than most people in the game. And in fact, in 1972 and then again in 1992, Nixon was asked to and did name his all-time dream team. And as the manager in 1972, he named Casey Stengel, greatest manager of all time. And then in 1992, he again did. And this is what he said, that the essence of diplomacy is to confuse the opposition. He said, Casey Stengel always knew what he was talking about. The opposition never knew what Casey was talking about. And then Nixon said, immortally, he said, if I had it to do over again, I'd have named Casey Stengel Secretary of State. I mean, very thought to this day still staggers. Henry Kissinger would not have been a match for the old professor. So yes, Nixon was in a league of his own.
You'll tell me when this happened, but Casey Stengel appeared before some congressional committee to discuss the antitrust laws, was it? And
1958.
And he made, I don't want to say a spectacle of himself because that has negative connotations. So he was quite entertaining, shall we say. And after he went through his usual Stengelese, and the committee asked Mantle Mickey Mantle, who was also there, what he thought. He says, my views are just about the same as Casey's.
That's exactly the case. And in fact, most Stengelisms were absolutely careening off the walls of the Cannon office building. And of course, the senators were in hysterics, even though they had no idea what Casey was talking about. And he invented a foreign language, and it was very foreign, but the American public loved it. Of course, it wasn't simply that Casey was a clown, even though he was, or at least pretended to be. But this was the great era in the 1950s. Stengel was the manager of the Yankees from 1949 to 1960. They won 10 pennants in 12 years, and they won 5 World Series in a row from 49 to 53. So he was, he talked with double entendres, and he talked in a way that was beloved by the American public. He was, without question, I think, baseball's greatest character, sports' greatest character of that entire decade.
So if Nixon was the greatest presidential baseball fan, and you mentioned before about some presidents had to feign their interest in the game because it was America's game, who would you say did the best job of feigning interest in the game?
Theodore Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, who we remember him now for having been this invincible figure, for having stormed up San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War, for having beaten criminals, for having been the commissioner of police in New York, for having taken on one stunning foe after another and just leaving them in the dust. But there's one foe that defeated Theodore Roosevelt, and that was baseball. Teddy Roosevelt hated baseball.
He called it
the simple reason it wasn't violent enough. It didn't have enough gore. Nobody got killed playing baseball, at least during Roosevelt's tenure. And of course, he loved boxing. He was a boxer. He loved football. It was violent for him, and other sports like boxing, among others. But Teddy Roosevelt was too much of a quote unquote, and this is a word I think that he may have invented, too much of a mollycoddle sport. And his daughter, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, used that same term. He said, Daddy wouldn't let us watch baseball. It was too mollycoddle. But here's the point. Roosevelt, both as vice president and as president, when he succeeded William McKinley, when McKinley was assassinated in 1901 in Buffalo, Roosevelt never let on to the American public that he hated baseball. He had to keep up this fiction to the point that officials of Major League Baseball came to the Oval Office and presented Roosevelt with season's pass and with other certificates proclaiming Roosevelt as the greatest fan in the land. Roosevelt had to keep up this absolute canard that he loved baseball. And the reason was this, that baseball was so exceedingly popular during that time that TR felt that if he exposed his dislike and indeed contempt for baseball, that the American public might say to him, "You're out of here," and that Roosevelt would lose his re-election in 1904. Or in 1908, because Roosevelt could have run again in that year and chose not to. So he had to pretend, and his correspondence with his sons, several of whom played baseball, make very clear that he was proud of his sons playing baseball, but he would never get the chance or would never on his own watch a game himself. So yes, there's no question, but that it was an exceeding fiction of Roosevelt to like the game. But he's really the only one. Every president since then has liked the game. Some have indeed obsessed upon the game, but all of them have at least feigned and in almost all cases truly liked the game to one degree or another.
So if Nixon was the most knowledgeable fan, the biggest fan, figuratively, Taft had to be literally the biggest fan.
He was, literally. They don't come any larger than William Howard Taft. This is a fella who was 300 pounds. I mean, those of you watching of a certain age who may remember the Jackie Gleason show from the 1960s, Gleason would adopt the caricature of Reginald Van Gleason III. Reginald Van Gleason III would wear high tops, and he would have a mustache, and he would put on a high hat, and he would clearly have boozed it up, and but he was a character, and he was absolutely beloved, and that was William Howard Taft. He was 300 pounds of Americana, and he loved the game. He'd been an amateur baseball pitcher in the 1880s, whose great goal in life was to make the bigs. He didn't make the big leagues, so he had to content himself with being president of the United States. And he did. He was inaugurated in 1909, and he also inaugurated something else. That is the first pitch. He was the first to, at Griffith Stadium in Washington, D.C., go out there on opening day, get the first pitch and throw it. Throw it either to a catcher, to a first baseman, or in many cases, for many years, you would have the visiting the players of the visiting team and also the Washington Senators, and they would congregate in a mass, and then TR or whoever, not TR, but rather William Howard Taft, or later it might be Woodrow Wilson, or later it might be Franklin Roosevelt or John F. Kennedy, or any of the presidents, really up until today, and he would throw the pitch over the mass of players, and then the mass of players would start galloping toward the souvenir, and they would knuckle each other, and they would try to knock the players over and clear the path so that they could get the presidential souvenir. And it really became one of the great social events of official Washington. We owe it all to William Howard Taft.
Now, you mentioned, excuse me, Taft's desire to play professional ball. How many of the presidents who followed, would you say were athletic enough to have careers in professional sports had they decided to go in that road? I know Eisenhower was
Yeah,
had a chance and we got into some questionable
yeah,
circumstances.
he did. Yes, they were very questionable. And in fact, if had the press been more prying, Eisenhower might not have been the great commander, five-star of Operation Overlord on D-Day, and certainly would never have been the president of the United States. Eisenhower liked baseball. He was good at baseball. He, but he was poor, and his family needed the Eisenhower sons in the early part of the 20th century to make money. And Eisenhower felt that by playing amateur baseball, as he did in Kansas, he could make money and contribute to the family. That was the only way Eisenhower felt that he could pay his way through school. School, in his case, being at West Point, the military academy on the Hudson. And so he played very fleetingly in an amateur league in Kansas. And the circumstances are rather murky, but it may have been that Ike was somewhat less than totally honest in filling out his papers at West Point. Because if he had said that, well, I played amateur baseball, I made some money there, he might not have gained entrance. In which case, all sorts of bad things for the United States might have happened. But he did obviously gain entrance. He was a great baseball fan, and he was always at opening day, with the one exception of the first opening day for the Eisenhower as president in 1953. Eisenhower liked something even more than baseball. He loved to golf. In fact, he put a putting green outside the Oval Office. So in 1953, Eisenhower swore opening day at Griffith Stadium to play golf at Augusta National. Fortunately for him, the game at Griffith Stadium was rained out. And Eisenhower was so seared by press criticism that he immediately boarded Air Force One, went back to Washington, made sure that he was at Griffith next day when the postponed opener was played. So in fact, that he did get to throw out the first pitch. But that was a lesson for him. He never again missed opening day. He did love the game. He would often go to opening day and other senators' games with Clark and then with Calvin Griffith, son of Clark Griffith, both owners of the Washington Senators. And so he loved the game. John F. Kennedy was a great athlete. He was a fan of the Boston Red Sox, although Ted Williams was not a fan of him. He was a supporter of Nixon in the 1960 election. Lyndon Johnson was not an athlete and did not particularly like baseball. But he didn't like anything if it didn't involve politics. He was the one track obsessed by politics, was LBJ. If I may, let me put a word in though for the greatest baseball athlete, because I think that the facts support this. My former boss, I'm a former speechwriter for George Herbert Walker Bush, our 41st president, and I think without question he is the greatest baseball player to have ever become president. This is someone who first picked up a bat at age 5 and said, true story, swung a bat and said, baseball has everything. Well, what better motto can you have? And he went on to become a very fine baseball player as a youth. He then, of course, went on to become a hero in World War II, almost lost his life when the Japanese shot down his plane when he was 22 years old, returned from World War II to become captain of his baseball team at Yale University. I should mention, as a youth, his hero had been Lou Gehrig, and Bush was his captain, and as I mentioned, and also first baseman, as Gehrig was at Yale. And there's a great picture of Babe Ruth dying in 1948. Bush would have been 24 then, and Ruth comes to Yale Field. and he's lost enormous weight because he's dying of cancer. And he presents the manuscript for the movie, the Babe Ruth story, to Captain Bush, as Ruth calls him, and it's a poignant picture. It's the single most requested picture, I am told, at the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. Bush and Ruth in 1948. So Bush really becomes he coached Little League with his 3 sons. He had baseball writers come to the Oval Office when he was president. He invented the President's Award, never been given before, never been given since, to Ted Williams and Joe DiMaggio in 1991 to celebrate their half century, the brilliant 1941 of DiMaggio hitting in 56 games, straight games, and Bush hitting in 406. And then after that magnificent ceremony in the Oval Office, when he gives them both the President's Award, he puts DiMaggio and Williams on Air Force One. Air Force One flies to Toronto, where the All-Star game is scheduled. And Bush has concocted a foreign policy, quote unquote, summit with the Canadian Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney. So this gives him an excuse to go to the All-Star game. But moreover, it lets him listen to the kid and to Joe D tell baseball stories on Air Force One for an hour and a half. This is one baseball whiz kid. And there are other, Bush 43, of course, is a baseball junkie. Bill Clinton learned baseball by listening to Harry Carey when he was young on the Cardinals network in Little Rock, KMOX from St. Louis, blanketing even Arkansas. And so one president after another, each one of them has a link to the game.
Well, certainly Junior Bush, for lack of a better
Yes,
phrase, was a part owner of the Texas Rangers, which had
he
been the
was.
Washington Senators who left Washington in the
Yes,
early 70s.
he was. And of course, we're talking about my book, The Presidents of the Pastime, and Franklin Roosevelt, whom we should mention, is on the cover. And there were several other presidents that were mentioned as possibilities for the cover. But my point was, look, we have to put FDR on because he's literally the spine of the book. And my point was, he was the reason that baseball survived in World War II. After the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, the baseball owners, not showing any kind of leadership, which is sadly very, very emblematic of what baseball has shown throughout the years. But the baseball owners sent a letter to Franklin Roosevelt, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who was then baseball commissioner. And it said, Mr. President, in essence, tell us what to do. We don't know whether baseball should be played during the entirety or part of the war. And the very next day, Roosevelt wrote back to Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the commissioner, and said, what came to be known as the famed green light letter. And he said, I believe strongly that baseball should be played during the war. It will provide enjoyment for many Americans at a very low price. It is a spine for the nation. It is important to the spirit of the nation. And he waved during that entire war a baseball-friendly flag. Even as 250 baseball players went abroad, either the Pacific or the Atlantic theaters. And baseball was so important to Roosevelt and so special to the nation that when other sports, they asked Roosevelt for the same imprimatur, the same special place in America's heart. Golf asked for this similar treatment. Bowling did. Horse racing did. Football did. Roosevelt either ignored them or said no to their letters. That's how special baseball was to FDR and to us.
Well, wasn't FDR a captain of his or manager?
He was the team manager of the baseball team at Groton. And it's interesting. He didn't know baseball obsessively as to Dixon, but he loved the game. And he loved going out to baseball and opening day, and he would throw it the first pitch with his unorthodox overhand lob like this. And he knew the game well enough, having been team manager at Groton, which was his prep school in New England, that he loved the game, which I think, the way I think a lot of us do. And he didn't like necessarily pitching duels, and he didn't know, thank God, about, launch angles and velocity and all the statistical mumbo jumbo. He loved the beauty of the game. He loved having base runners on. And at Griffith Stadium, it had these enormous distances, these great and vast power alleys. And it was made for FDR. And he said, I love the highest score for games. I love when balls are hit in the gaps and the runners are running and the fielders are chasing the balls and the shortstop is going for the relay throw. In other words, Ron, he knew why people loved the game. And I wish to heaven that some of the leaders in baseball today and some of the players would understand why people fall in love with the game today.
I'm wondering, the certainly convenience of having the senators in Washington for all those years made it easy for the president to go out to a game. How did things change after the senators went to Texas in the early 70s?
Well, there was an enormous gap. I fault Nixon, in fact, in the book for not having acted more decisively to try to keep the senators in Washington in 1971. Bob Short was the owner, and an eccentric, selfish, narcissistic owner he was. So perhaps no intrusion by Nixon or any other president could have kept the senators there. But Nixon didn't try, I don't believe, enough. And then, of course, this is the second time the senators had moved. They had gone from Washington to Minneapolis in 1960, at which time the senators, too, had come to D.C. So this is the second time baseball had left, which marked, like Kane, Washington as a two-time loser. And this, which I think was unfair, and having lived in D.C. for 14 to 15 years, I came to feel that this is very unfair and testified at congressional meetings, in fact, to that effect. But there's no question, but that it kept Washington from getting a team from 1972 through 2005. Those long, dark, awful days, 33 to 34 years, when the nation's capital did not have a team for the nation's sport. I mean, talk about your irony. And to his great credit, Ronald Reagan in the 1980s moved, in essence, to make the Orioles Washington's adopted team. As I write in the book, he began baseball events having baseball events starring the Orioles, starring Hall of Famers, Little Leaguers on the South Lawn of the White House. He began taking the helicopter beginning in 1983, almost every year to Baltimore to throw out the first pitch, as if the Orioles were Washington's and America's first team. John Miller, the Orioles broadcaster, was heard throughout the corridors of Washington over WTOP, which was Washington's really official station, if you would, in many ways, news. So you followed the Orioles. I know I did as a Red Sox fan, and it was marvelous during those years. And then following him, Clinton did the same thing. And then, of course, you yielded to Bush in the early 2000s, and he did the same. And so you kept baseball interest alive. This is key, so that when the Expos, through no fault of their own, Olympic Stadium was a terrible place for them to play, and they deserve, Montreal does, a team, in my view, without question. It was unfair to what happened to them, and it never would have happened had they remained in Jerry Park. But in the early 2000s, when attendance really tanked, and the Expos became the Washington Nationals, what a wonderful day that was. I know expatriates like me, having lived in Washington and now in upstate New York, I felt like I was a citizen. I felt like my team had come home. And I think to a certain sense America had, because this is the nation's capital and it deserved a team. And I think we see the enormous interest in Washington and throughout really that tri-state area of Virginia and Maryland. The ratings are enormous on radio and TV. The interest, the attendance is vast as well. So this is a success story, I think, and we all should be glad for that.
I think one moment that always comes to mind, regardless of team affiliation, regardless of politics, is George Bush II throwing out the first pitch in the World
Yeah.
Series after 9/11.
We have a full page photo of Bush throwing that pitch out in 2001. And that to me was the high watermark of the Bush presidency. I don't say that in a pro or con view. I talk here emotionally, and I think Bush would agree. He said there was more pressure on him that night than there was in any other moment during his presidency, and I can understand why. What happened on 9/11 was, of course, historic and tragic in every sense of the term, happening in our largest city. And Bush found his voice going to New York. We remember what happened, and going up and saying, amid the rubble of 9/11, I can hear your voice. Remember that. And then, of course, going. And anyone who has thrown out a first pitch, particularly from the rubber, as I have, in a minor league setting, knows how difficult that is. So here you have the President of the United States in Yankee Stadium. And this is the first time. I was amazed when I found this through research, the very first time that the President of the United States had visited Yankee Stadium for a World Series game. I mean, that is astonishing given how many World Series that the Yankees have been a part of. So here he is. It's game 3, right? 2001, and Bush is going to the mound. And the pressure, the emotion, the cry for simple justice, given what had happened only a few weeks before, from the triple tiers in the house that Ruth built, the most famous edifice, ballpark in the world, save perhaps the Roman Colosseum, shook that ballpark to its foundation. And Bush, cool as the other side of the pillow, goes to the mound, goes to the rubber, as Derek Jeter had urged him to do only minutes before. And he winds up and he throws a perfect strike. I mean, he could not have thrown a more perfect ball if he had walked that pitch ball to home plate and planted it in the catcher's glove.
And what was it that Jeter warned him about?
I'm trying to remember.
He said, "Don't bounce it."
Not bouncing on the first pitch. And the irony of that, of course, is that is what his father, Bush 41, was forever doing, bouncing it on the first pitch. We were always kidding him about that because 41 was such a great baseball player. And Bush 41, of course, always gave it back in a gentle kind of way. He said, well, I do that because of the 42-pound steel vest that the Secret Service makes me wear, which is true enough. But then, of course, after Bush left office, he kept still bouncing it on the first pitch, even after he didn't have to wear the steel vest. So go figure. But in any event, it was a stunning moment. And the regularity with which, when that book came out, and indeed with radio and television shows ever since then, the regularity with which I am asked about that pitch by George Bush on, what was it, October 30th, I believe, 2001, the regularity with which people roused that question eclipses any other issue regarding any other president. People remember.
Well, it's a fine
Remember.
book. It's The
Yeah.
Presidents and the Pastime, The History of Baseball and the White House. And we've been talking with its author, Curt Smith. Curt, I want to thank you very much for talking with us today and wish you all the best and health and safety as we go through the current situation.
Ron, I appreciate it, and it would be impolitic of me not to mention the work that you have done, particularly the bookshelf. Any baseball author yearns for a position in that magnificent podium, and it doesn't happen without you. So appearing here as a writer particularly is important to me. I thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.